The room was quiet when my father set his fork down. No one was laughing anymore. 25 candles burned slowly in front of me, melting into the white frosting of the cake my mother had insisted on bringing to the restaurant. The waiter stood a few feet away, waiting to clear the plates. My aunt stared at the tablecloth like she had suddenly forgotten how patterns worked. My father leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said it in the same tone people used to comment on the weather. "We only kept you for the tax benefits." No one corrected him. No one even looked surprised. And in that moment, I realized something far worse than the sentence itself. Everyone at that table had known long before I did. For most of my life, nothing about my family seemed unusual. We were not affectionate, but we were stable. That was the word teachers used when they asked about home. Stable. My parents owned the same house for decades. Bills were paid on time. The refrigerator was always stocked. I had clean clothes, a quiet bedroom, and a predictable routine. In our house, predictability was the closest thing we had to comfort. My father worked in accounting for a mid-sized logistics company. He woke up at the same time every morning, made coffee in the same chipped mug, and read the financial section of the newspaper while the coffee cooled. He was not a loud man. His voice rarely rose above conversation level, and when it did, the change felt so unusual that it stopped everyone in the room. My mother worked part-time at a dental office. She kept the house organized with a level of precision that made everything feel carefully measured. Cabinets were labeled. Receipts were filed. Important documents lived in a locked drawer in the study. I learned early that the drawer was not to be opened. It was not a dramatic rule. My mother had simply said once in a calm voice, "Those papers are complicated. You would not understand them." So I never tried. That was the kind of household we were. Rules existed quietly, and once spoken, they did not need repeating. As a child, I rarely caused problems. Not because I was especially obedient, but because I understood something about the atmosphere of our home. My parents did not react well to disruptions. They preferred smooth days, quiet evenings, and predictable outcomes. So I became predictable. Teachers described me as mature. I finished homework early. I stayed out of trouble. Parent-teacher conferences were short because there was rarely anything urgent to discuss. My parents seemed satisfied with that arrangement. They attended the conferences, listened to the teachers, and nodded when someone mentioned that I was responsible for my age. Then we would drive home in near silence. I used to wonder if other families talked more in their cars. At dinner, conversation focused on practical things. My father sometimes talked about tax law changes or company policy updates. My mother discussed schedules at the dental office or rising grocery prices. No one talked about feelings. If I mentioned something that happened at school, my parents listened politely, but the conversation rarely lasted long. My father often responded with practical advice. "Focus on what matters," he would say. "What matters?" I once asked. "Results," he said. That answer seemed final. Birthdays in our family followed a familiar pattern. We did not host large parties or invite groups of friends. Instead, we went to dinner somewhere quiet, usually the same restaurant, a place with soft lighting, heavy wooden chairs, and waiters who spoke in careful voices. My mother ordered the cake a few days in advance. My father paid the bill. A few relatives sometimes joined us. My aunt, occasionally a cousin, once or twice my grandmother before she passed away. Everyone behaved politely. I never expected dramatic celebrations. It simply was not the kind of family we were. Looking back, I realized something else about those dinners. They were calm, but they were also careful. Conversations avoided certain directions without anyone saying so directly. Questions about family history were answered briefly. Topics drifted back toward safe territory, work, schedules, or current events. As a child, I assumed all families managed conversations that way. Children learn early which questions are welcome and which ones cause silence. I learned quickly. My parents were not cruel people. That is important to say clearly. They did not yell often. They did not insult me. They did not create scenes in public or private. Our home functioned with quiet efficiency. But warmth was rare, praise even rarer. When I graduated high school, my father shook my hand instead of hugging me. "You handled your responsibilities well," he said. At the time, that felt like a compliment. I carried that sentence with me for years. In college, I visited home during holidays and occasional weekends. The house always looked the same. The labeled cabinets, the quiet evenings, the locked drawer in the study. Nothing appeared different. My parents seemed comfortable with the arrangement we had built over time. I was the dependable child who did not create complications. They were the responsible adults who maintained order. It felt balanced. When I turned 25, the birthday dinner felt like another step in the same pattern. Same restaurant, same quiet lighting, same careful conversation. I remember sitting at the table that evening and thinking how consistent my life had been, how predictable, how reliable. At the time, I believed consistency meant security. I did not yet understand that some systems are consistent for a very different reason, and that the quietest structures are sometimes built on decisions no one intends to explain. If someone had asked me during my teenage years whether I felt loved, I probably would have said yes. Not with confidence, but without hesitation. Love, in my house, was never expressed in obvious ways. There were no long conversations late at night, no emotional reassurance, no physical closeness that lingered longer than necessary. But the lights stayed on. Food appeared in the refrigerator. Tuition forms were signed without argument. I interpreted those things as proof. It took years before I realized that stability can exist without attachment. When I look back now, the earliest signs were small enough to dismiss. They arrived as brief comments, passing moments, or sentences that felt slightly strange but not important enough to question. My parents talked about money more than most families I knew, not in a worried way. My father rarely sounded stressed about finances. Instead, he spoke about money like it was a puzzle, something structured, something to be arranged correctly. Sometimes during dinner, he explained small details about taxes or deductions. "Most people do not understand the system," he once said, cutting his food slowly. "They leave benefits on the table because they do not read the rules carefully." My mother nodded as if she had heard the same sentence many times before. At the time, I barely listened. Tax law sounded distant and boring, the kind of adult conversation teenagers naturally ignore. But certain phrases appeared often enough that they began to settle quietly in my memory. Dependence, deductions, timing, filing status. I remember one night when my father spread several forms across the dining table after dinner. Papers covered the surface in careful rows. My mother sat beside him with a calculator. I walked past the room to get a glass of water. My father glanced up. "School's still full-time?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded once and made a small note on the paper in front of him. At the time, it felt like a normal question. Now I understand it was not. My mother occasionally made comments that carried a tone I could not quite interpret when I was younger. "You were a very expensive baby," she once said while organizing old photo albums. She smiled after saying it, but the smile looked tight. I assumed she meant diapers, daycare, and medical bills. That was what people usually meant when they talked about the cost of raising children. but she said it more than once, always with the same careful smile. "You were complicated," she added another time, sliding a photo back into a plastic sleeve. I did not ask what complicated meant. Questions often slowed conversations in our house. Family gatherings sometimes revealed the same strange undercurrent. My aunt visited several times each year, usually bringing small gifts and polite conversation. She had a warmer personality than my parents, but even she seemed careful around certain subjects. Once, when I was about 16, she and my mother were talking quietly in the kitchen while I sat in the living room pretending to read. I heard my aunt say something in a low voice. "Well, at least it worked out financially." There was a pause. Then my mother replied, "Yes, eventually." When my aunt noticed me in the next room, the conversation ended abruptly. She smiled too quickly and asked about school. At 16, I did not think much about it. Teenagers are skilled at ignoring things that do not immediately affect them. Teachers, on the other hand, often described me in ways that surprised my parents. Responsible, independent, self-sufficient. Those words appeared repeatedly on report cards and during conferences. My father always nodded when he heard them, as if the results matched a plan he had already designed. "That is what we expect," he would say calmly. I never heard him say he was proud, but he never sounded disappointed either. Which in our house felt like approval. Every year around March, the house developed a certain quiet tension. Tax season. My father spent long evenings in the study with the door half closed. The printer ran constantly. Stacks of documents moved from one folder to another. Occasionally, he called me into the room to confirm something. "Are you still living in the dorm this semester?" "Yes." "Full course load?" "Yes." He would write something down and dismiss me with a nod. The questions never felt personal. They felt procedural. My mother treated the entire process with unusual seriousness. She checked numbers twice, filed receipts in precise envelopes, and occasionally reminded my father about deadlines. "Do not miss the dependent section again," she once said from the doorway. He waved a hand dismissively. "I know where it is." They did not explain what that meant. I did not ask. At the time, I believed these were simply the habits of organized adults. Looking back, those moments now feel different, like pieces of a conversation that had been happening long before I was old enough to understand it. The strange thing about early discomfort is how easily it disappears in the moment. You feel it for a second, then you explain it away, and life continues as if nothing important happened. That is what I did for years. I ignored the small pauses, the strange comments, the conversations that ended when I entered the room. I assumed there was always a reasonable explanation. I believed my parents were simply practical people. And practical people, I told myself, often sounded colder than they meant to be. It would take much longer before I realized that some sentences are not misunderstood. They are simply spoken too early for you to recognize what they mean. The first time I seriously questioned something about my family, I was 20. Not because of an argument, not because of a confession. Because of paperwork. College had introduced me to a kind of administrative world I had never paid attention to before. Financial aid forms, housing documents, tax information, and identity verification. Forms asked questions I had never needed to answer on my own. For the first time, I had to read the details carefully. One afternoon, I sat in the student services office reviewing my financial aid file. The advisor across the desk was patient and methodical, flipping through the pages of my documents. Then she paused. "Your parents claimed you as a dependent last year," she said. "Yes," I replied automatically. She nodded, but the pause lingered. "That's fine," she said. "I just want to confirm your housing status. You lived on campus full-time that year, correct? Yes. She made a note and continued through the file. Nothing in her tone suggested a problem. But the pause stayed in my mind longer than I expected. At the time, I assumed she was simply being thorough. Later that evening, I called my father. I was filling out some forms today, I told him. They asked about dependent status. Of course they did, he said. His voice sounded calm, almost amused. That's standard. Does it matter that I live in the dorms? No, he replied immediately. Those systems don't understand real tax law. Leave that part to me. The certainty in his voice ended the conversation. For most of my life, my father had been the authority on anything related to paperwork or finances. If he said something was normal, I rarely questioned it. But that moment planted a small seed of doubt. Over the next year, other small details began to surface. Nothing dramatic, just inconsistencies. During winter break, I was home when my father asked me for several documents. I need your enrollment verification, he said. For what? Records. The answer felt incomplete. Is it for taxes? I asked. He looked up from his laptop. Why are you asking? His tone wasn't angry, but it was sharp enough to make the room feel smaller. I was just curious, I said. There's nothing complicated about it, he replied. You're still a student. He returned to his screen, clearly finished with the conversation. I gave him the document, but the question remained in my mind longer than it should have. Later that year, another moment arrived in a place I did not expect. A family reunion. My mother's side of the family gathered once every few years in a rented community hall. It was a quiet event, tables of food, polite conversations, relatives I saw rarely but recognized by name. I was standing near the coffee table when one of my older cousins approached. He was in his 30s, someone I barely knew but had always found easy to talk to. So you're finishing college soon? He asked. Next year, he nodded approvingly. Good timing, he said. Timing for what? I asked. The question seemed harmless, but his reaction was immediate. He looked at me for a moment as if he had said something he could not take back. Then he shook his head. Nothing important, he said quickly. The conversation moved to other topics, but the phrase stayed with me. Good timing. For what? I noticed something else during that reunion. Certain relatives behaved strangely when conversations drifted toward my childhood. If someone mentioned the year I was born, the discussion shifted quickly. If someone joked about how difficult babies could be, my mother changed the subject. It happened more than once. Small deflections, small silences. None of it seemed serious enough to confront directly, but the pattern began to feel familiar. By the time I entered my final year of college, I understood tax systems far better than I had as a teenager. Not because I studied finance, because every adult eventually has to learn how paperwork shapes their life. While filling out forms one evening, I noticed something that made me stop reading. Dependent status rules, age limits, financial support requirements. Most of it was straightforward, but a few sections were more complicated. Certain benefits extended longer under specific conditions. Conditions related to education, residency, documentation. I sat at my desk reading the same paragraph several times, not because I believed my parents had done anything wrong, because for the first time, the fragments of past conversations started aligning with something real. Dependence, timing, enrollment verification, good timing. The realization did not arrive as a clear conclusion. It arrived as a quiet possibility. And possibilities are dangerous things, because once they exist, your mind begins searching for evidence, even when you wish it wouldn't. I told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation. My father understood tax law better than I did. My parents had always handled financial matters responsibly. But that night, while closing the laptop, I felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not fear, just a small, persistent thought that refused to disappear. Maybe there were parts of my childhood that had never been explained, and maybe the explanations had never been meant for me. The first time I asked my parents a direct question, I had already spent months convincing myself not to. I had reread the tax rules several times. I had gone through my financial aid forms. I had compared dates and requirements, looking for a clear misunderstanding that would make the entire thought disappear. It never did. Eventually, the uncertainty became heavier than the risk of asking. I waited until I was home during spring break. The house looked exactly the same as it always had, quiet, organized, carefully maintained. The study door was open, and my father sat at the desk reviewing paperwork. The same desk where tax documents had been spread across the table when I was younger. I stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Can I ask you something about taxes?" He did not look up immediately. "You already are," he said. I stepped into the room. "It's about dependent status," I said. "Some of the rules seem more complicated than I thought." Now he looked up, not confused, not surprised, just mildly irritated. "What exactly are you trying to figure out?" I hesitated for a moment. "I noticed that you've claimed me as a dependent every year," I said carefully, "even when I was living in the dorms full time." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "That's normal." "I was reading that it depends on financial support and residency," I said. He gave a short laugh. "You've been reading internet advice." "It was on the IRS website." "That doesn't change my answer." His tone was calm, but there was something final in the way he said it. "You're still a student. The situation qualifies." The explanation sounded simple, too simple. "I just wanted to understand how it works," I said. "You don't need to understand it," he replied. "That's my responsibility." The conversation ended there, or at least it should have, but the unease remained. A few days later, I mentioned the subject again while my mother was preparing dinner. "I asked Dad about the dependent thing," I said. She continued slicing vegetables without looking up. "And he said it was normal." "That's correct." I waited. The explanation never came. "I was reading some of the rules," I said slowly. "Some of them seemed different from what we've been doing." This time she stopped cutting. She placed the knife on the counter and looked at me with a strange expression I had not seen before. Not anger, something closer to disappointment. "You've been researching our finances." "I was just trying to understand. You're overthinking something that doesn't concern you." The words were quiet, but they carried more weight than her usual tone. "It does concern me," I said. "My name is on those documents." She sighed softly. "You've been spending too much time online." "That's not really the issue." "Then what is?" The question was asked calmly, but it felt like a challenge. "I just want to know if everything was done correctly." The silence that followed lasted longer than any argument I had ever had with my parents. Finally, she spoke. "Do you know how much it costs to raise a child?" I blinked. "That's not what I was asking." "We paid for your education," she continued. "Your housing, your food, everything you needed." "I know. So now you're auditing us." "I'm not auditing anyone." She picked up the knife again. "You sound ungrateful." The word landed quietly, but it stayed in the room. I tried again. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I just want to understand how it worked." Her voice softened slightly, but the distance remained. "Your father understands tax systems better than you do." "I know." "Then why are we having this conversation?" I did not have an answer that would end the discussion safely. "I guess I just wanted clarity." She shook her head. "Clarity about what?" I felt something shift inside the conversation. Not information, control. My parents were not explaining anything. They were reframing the question itself. "You're making this sound suspicious," she said. "I'm not." "You are." She resumed cutting vegetables with careful precision. Families support each other, that's normal. I know. Then stop looking for problems where none exist. The conversation ended the same way the earlier one had, with a quiet instruction to stop asking. Over the next few weeks, the same pattern repeated. If I mentioned anything related to taxes, my father responded with calm authority. "You're misunderstanding the rules." If I mentioned it to my mother, she framed the question as disrespect. "You're questioning your own family." Neither of them offered details. Neither of them showed uncertainty. Instead, the message remained consistent. Nothing unusual had happened. I was imagining complications. I was misreading information. And the more I asked, the more I began to feel something unexpected. Not anger, doubt. The kind of doubt that slowly makes you question your own instincts. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was misunderstanding the rules. Maybe I had turned a simple financial matter into something bigger than it needed to be. For a while, I stopped asking. Life returned to its usual rhythm. Classes, work. Quiet phone calls with my parents that never lasted long. But something had changed inside my mind. Once a question exists, it does not disappear simply because someone tells you to stop asking it. It waits. And sometimes it waits for something very small to bring it back. In my case, that something arrived through a document I had never expected to see. The document appeared by accident. I was not searching for evidence. At that point, I had already spent several months trying to convince myself that the questions in my mind were unnecessary. My parents had made their position clear. They believed I was misunderstanding the situation, and part of me wanted that explanation to be true. Life is easier when your doubts are wrong. The discovery happened during something ordinary, organizing paperwork before moving into a new apartment after graduation. College requires an unusual number of documents. Loan agreements, tax forms, insurance confirmations, transcripts. Most of it had been stuffed into folders and envelopes over the years. I sat on the floor of my small apartment, sorting everything into neat piles. Important records, old school forms, things I could throw away. One envelope looked older than the others. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, the kind of aging that happens when documents sit untouched for years. My name was written across the front in my father's handwriting. Inside were several copies of tax returns. At first, I assumed they were simply backups of the records my father kept at home. He had always been meticulous about documentation. But when I started reading them, something felt wrong. The year listed on the first return was from when I was 22. I remembered that year clearly. I had not been living at home. I had been renting an off-campus apartment with 2 roommates while finishing my degree. I paid for most of my living expenses myself using a combination of part-time work and student loans. Yet the document listed me as a dependent under my parents' household. I read the page twice. Then again, the explanation could still have been simple. Tax law sometimes allows complicated situations. Maybe the rules were broader than I understood. But the next document raised another question. And the next one after that. Multiple years. Same classification. Same claim. Each return listed me as financially dependent in ways that did not match the reality I remembered. I sat on the floor with the papers spread in front of me. The apartment was quiet. Outside, traffic moved through the evening streets. Someone in the building next door was playing music softly through thin walls, normal sounds. But the room around me felt different, not dramatic, just heavier. For the first time, the possibility that had been floating in the background of my thoughts began to take shape. My parents had not simply misunderstood something. They had made deliberate choices. Still, I resisted drawing conclusions. One explanation remained possible. Maybe the rules allowed it. There were professionals who understood these systems better than I did, so I decided to ask someone who might know. The next week, I scheduled a consultation with a local accountant. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I simply brought copies of the forms and asked a question. Can you explain how dependent status works in situations like this? The accountant was an older man with careful habits. He read each page slowly, occasionally adjusting his glasses. After several minutes, he leaned back in his chair. "These filings are aggressive," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means they're pushing the boundaries of what qualifies." "Is it illegal?" He paused. "That depends on details I don't have." "What kind of details?" "Living arrangements, financial support, documentation." I told him about my apartment during those years, my part-time jobs, the loans. He listened quietly. Then he tapped one of the forms. "If what you're telling me is accurate, these claims would be difficult to justify." The room felt very still. "Why would someone do it?" I asked. The accountant shrugged slightly. "Tax benefits can be significant, especially if someone understands how to structure them." The answer was calm, professional, but it carried an implication I could not ignore. When I left his office, I did not feel angry. I felt something closer to confirmation. The documents alone did not tell the entire story, but they suggested something important. My existence had been connected to financial calculations in ways I had never fully understood. The next piece of information arrived from somewhere unexpected. My aunt. We were speaking on the phone about ordinary things: work, my new apartment, the transition after college. The conversation was casual, the way most of our conversations had always been. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she said something strange. "You know, there were a lot of discussions when you were born." The sentence caught my attention immediately. "Discussions about what?" She hesitated. "Oh, nothing serious." "What kind of discussions?" Another pause. The tone of her voice shifted slightly. "Your parents had a lot to consider at the time." "Consider about what?" Her response came quickly now. "Every new parent has decisions to make." The explanation sounded rehearsed, but something in her voice told me she had already said more than she intended. "Aunt Maria," I said carefully, "what were they deciding?" Silence filled the line for several seconds, then she spoke quietly. "There were financial concerns back then." "What kind of concerns?" More silence. Finally, she said something that changed the entire direction of the conversation. "They weren't sure it made sense." "Makes sense to have a child." Her answer came softly. "They looked at everything very practically." The call ended shortly after that. She never finished the explanation, but she did not need to. By that point, the documents, the conversations, and the patterns were beginning to align, still incomplete, still fragmented, but moving toward something that felt increasingly difficult to deny. For the first time, I started doing something I had never done before. I began keeping records, not accusations, just timelines. Dates, documents, conversations, because one realization had begun to settle quietly in my mind. The truth about my family might not exist in memories alone. It might exist in systems, and systems have a habit of leaving records behind. Once you begin documenting something, the world starts to look different, not more dramatic, more precise. For most of my life, I had relied on memory to understand my family. Conversations, routines, impressions, but memory is soft. It bends around emotions and assumptions. Documents do not bend as easily. After the conversation with the accountant and the phone call with my aunt, I started treating the situation differently. I stopped looking for reassurance and started collecting information. Quietly, I created a simple folder on my computer. Inside it were copies of tax returns, financial aid records, lease agreements, and anything else that could establish a timeline of where I lived and how my expenses had been covered. I did not tell anyone I was doing it. There was no reason to. At first, the process felt mechanical. Dates and documents rarely carry emotion on their own. But as the timeline grew longer, patterns began to appear. Certain years stood out. Years when I had clearly been living independently while still being listed as a dependent in my parents' filings. Years when my financial aid documents showed that I was responsible for most of my own expenses. The more information I gathered, the more consistent the pattern looked. My parents had not simply claimed me as a dependent during childhood. They had extended the claim as long as possible. Every year, every opportunity, I kept telling myself that tax law was complicated, that there might still be explanations I did not understand. But the system I was building told a quiet story, and that story did not include many gray areas. Eventually, my parents noticed that I was asking more detailed questions. The shift happened during a phone call with my father one evening. He had called to ask about something routine, an address change for one of my accounts. At the end of the conversation, I asked another question. Do you still have copies of my enrollment verification from senior year? There was a brief pause on the line. Why? I'm organizing some records. You don't need those. I'd still like to keep copies. For what purpose? His voice had become sharper than usual. Just personal files. Another pause. You're still investigating this tax nonsense, aren't you? The word investigating sounded strange in his voice. I'm organizing documents, I said. You're looking for problems. I'm looking for clarity. There is no problem. His tone was calm, but the calmness felt controlled rather than natural. You're misunderstanding how these systems work. That's possible, I said, but I'd still like to see the records. His answer came immediately. No. The refusal was so direct that I did not know how to respond. I thought you kept everything filed, I said. I do. Then why can't I see them? Another pause. Then he said something that felt less like an explanation and more like a warning. Because you're treating your own family like an audit. The sentence hung in the air between us. I'm not accusing anyone, I said quietly. You are implying it. That's not my intention. Intentions don't matter. The conversation ended shortly afterward. When we hung up, I sat at my desk for several minutes staring at the folder on my computer. The reaction had been stronger than I expected. Until that moment, my parents had treated my questions with mild dismissal. Now there was something else in their responses. Control. Within a few weeks, other changes began appearing around the edges of family communication. My aunt stopped mentioning anything related to the past. When I asked about visiting, she suddenly seemed busy. A cousin who usually responded to my messages quickly began taking days to reply. When we did speak, the conversation stayed carefully on safe topics. Work. Weather, travel plans. Nothing related to family history. It was not hostility. It was distance. As if a quiet signal had been sent through the family that certain subjects were no longer safe. The most revealing moment arrived unexpectedly through something routine. Insurance. I was reviewing old health insurance records for a job application when I noticed something odd about the coverage dates. My parents had kept me on their policy longer than most families typically do. Even during years when I was living several states away. At first, that seemed generous. But when I compared the dates with the tax documents, another pattern appeared. Coverage extensions aligned almost perfectly with the same years they had continued claiming dependent benefits. Every decision seemed to point in the same direction. Housing, insurance, education documentation. Everything connected to my status within the household had been structured carefully, strategically. As if my existence had been part of a long-term financial equation. I did not confront my parents with these observations, not because I was afraid of the conversation. Because I already knew how it would go. Denial, dismissal, a reminder that I was misunderstanding complicated systems. Instead, I continued doing the only thing that had produced real answers so far. I kept documenting, quietly, dates, policies, forms, timelines. At some point during that process, a strange realization settled into my mind. If my parents had truly believed everything they did was normal, they would not be reacting with such careful resistance. People who are confident in their actions usually explain them easily. They do not block access to records. They do not redirect conversations through silence. The tension in our family did not explode into arguments. It became something quieter, more controlled. Every phone call felt slightly more formal, every visit slightly shorter. No one said the word conflict, but the atmosphere had changed. By the time my 25th birthday approached, the entire situation had reached a strange kind of equilibrium. My parents knew I had questions. I knew they were avoiding answers. The documents continued to accumulate in my files, and the truth, whatever its full shape might be, was slowly becoming harder for anyone to deny. But I still had not confronted them directly. In fact, by the time the birthday dinner arrived, I had already decided something important. I was not going to start the confrontation. I wanted to see whether the truth would appear on its own. Sometimes it does, especially when enough people in a room already know it. By the time my 25th birthday arrived, the question was no longer whether something had happened. The documents had already answered that. What remained unclear was something quieter, and in many ways heavier. Why no one had ever said anything? For months I had been assembling timelines, comparing records, and slowly reconstructing decisions that had shaped most of my childhood. The patterns were no longer subtle. Housing arrangements, insurance coverage, dependent filings, enrollment documentation. Every system my parents managed had been aligned in a way that extended my financial usefulness as long as possible. The realization did not come with anger. It came with a kind of stillness, because anger usually requires a moment of surprise. By that point, surprise was gone. The more difficult realization was something else entirely. Other people had known. Not every detail, perhaps, but enough to recognize what was happening. My aunt's hesitation on the phone, my cousin's strange comment about timing, the sudden discomfort whenever family conversations drifted toward the year I was born. Individually, each moment had been easy to dismiss. Together, they suggested something very different, a quiet awareness. The kind families sometimes develop around uncomfortable truths. No one explains it directly, but everyone learns the boundaries of what can be said. For most of my life, I had been outside that awareness. Now I was beginning to see it. The birthday dinner had been planned weeks earlier by my mother. She chose the same restaurant we had visited for years. Soft lighting, quiet music, heavy wooden tables spaced far enough apart that conversations stayed private. Routine had always been important to my parents. Consistency created the appearance of stability. When I arrived at the restaurant that evening, the table was already half full. My father sat near the end, reviewing something on his phone. My mother spoke quietly with the waiter. My aunt and one of my cousins were seated across from them. Everyone greeted me politely. There were smiles, handshakes, a quick hug from my aunt. Nothing about the room felt tense at first, but once we all sat down, I began noticing the same small signals I had started recognizing over the past year. Conversations avoided certain directions. When someone mentioned the past, the topic shifted quickly. My father asked about my job. My mother asked whether my apartment lease was secure for the year. Normal questions, safe questions. For a while, the dinner continued exactly the way every family dinner had always continued. Food arrived. Glasses were filled. My aunt asked about travel plans. Someone mentioned a recent news story. Polite conversation moved around the table like a carefully guided current. And beneath all of it, I felt something else. Awareness. Not mine. Theirs. It appeared in the way my aunt occasionally glanced at my father before speaking. In the way my cousin paused when certain subjects came close to family history. Even the waiter seemed to sense the restraint in the room, keeping his voice unusually quiet whenever he approached the table. About halfway through the meal, my mother mentioned something about rising property taxes in our old neighborhood. That was normal conversation for our family. My father responded immediately, explaining a recent change in local tax policy. He spoke with the same calm authority he had always used when discussing financial systems. Everyone listened politely, but then my cousin asked a simple follow-up question. "Didn't you restructure a lot of things years ago for tax reasons?" The sentence seemed harmless. My father nodded. "Yes, anyone who understands the system does." My cousin smiled slightly. "You've always been very strategic about it." There was something in the way he said the word strategic that made my aunt glance down at the table. My father did not seem to notice. "Most people are careless," he continued. "They ignore the benefits available to them." My mother nodded in quiet agreement. The conversation could have ended there, but my cousin asked another question, not accusatory, just curious. "Didn't some of that start around the time you had him?" He gestured toward me casually. The table became very still, not suddenly. Gradually, like a room where the air pressure has shifted, my father leaned back in his chair. For the first time that evening, he looked directly at me for more than a second. Then he gave a small shrug. "Well," he said calmly, "we only kept him for the tax benefits." The sentence landed on the table with almost no emotion. He said it the way someone might comment on a change in the weather. For a moment, no one moved. No one laughed. No one corrected him. The silence that followed was longer than anything that had happened during the entire dinner. And in that silence, something became clear in a way no document had ever made clear before. Everyone at that table had understood the truth long before I did. No one had ever planned to say it out loud. The strange thing about a sentence like that is how quietly it changes a room. There was no immediate argument. No one raised their voice. No plates shattered against the floor. The waiter continued walking between tables carrying trays of food. Soft music still played through the restaurant speakers. From a distance, nothing about our table would have looked unusual. But inside the small circle of chairs around that table, something had shifted permanently. My father did not appear to notice at first. He had already reached for his glass of water, taking a small sip the way people do when they believe a conversation has ended. My cousin stared down at his plate. My aunt had frozen with her hands folded in her lap. My mother looked at my father, not surprised, not shocked, just tense. The silence stretched longer than anyone seemed comfortable with. Finally, my father looked around the table. "What?" he asked. No one answered. The question sounded genuine, which somehow made the moment feel even stranger. "You said it," my cousin said quietly. My father frowned slightly. "Said what?" My cousin did not repeat the sentence. He did not need to. Everyone in the room had heard it. For a moment, my father seemed to search his own memory. Then he waved a hand dismissively. "Oh," he said, "that." The tone carried mild annoyance, as if the room was reacting too seriously to something trivial. "It was a joke." No one laughed. The waiter approached our table at that exact moment, asking politely if anyone needed refills. My mother shook her head quickly. When the waiter left, the silence returned. My aunt finally spoke. "That wasn't funny." Her voice was gentle, but the words carried weight. My father leaned back again. "You're taking it too literally." My cousin lifted his eyes from his plate. "Then explain it." My father's expression hardened slightly. "There's nothing to explain." My mother stepped in before the conversation could sharpen further. "He didn't mean it the way it sounded," she said. Her voice carried the careful calm she always used when smoothing over uncomfortable moments. My father nodded. "Exactly." But the explanation felt thin, not because of the words themselves, because of the reactions around the table. My aunt was still staring down at her folded hands. My cousin was watching my father with an expression that looked more tired than angry. And my mother, who had just defended the statement, had not once looked at me. I realized something then. The problem was not the sentence itself. It was the absence of surprise. No one had reacted the way people react when they hear something outrageous for the first time. There had been no shock, only silence. And silence in families often means recognition. My father seemed to sense the shift eventually. He straightened in his chair and looked directly at me. "You know I was joking," he said. The statement was delivered calmly, almost as a correction. Everyone waited for my response. For years, I had imagined what a confrontation might look like if the truth ever surfaced. I had pictured anger, questions, some kind of emotional release. None of those things arrived. Instead, I heard my own voice say something very simple. "I heard you." That was all, no accusation, no raised tone, just acknowledgement. My father studied my face for a moment as if trying to determine whether I believed the explanation he had just offered. Then he nodded once. "Good." The conversation did not fully recover after that. People returned to small talk, but the rhythm was broken. Sentences ended quickly. Glasses were emptied faster than usual. My aunt checked the time several times before finally standing. "I should head home," she said softly. My cousin left shortly after. My parents and I remained at the table for a few minutes longer, the empty plates sitting between us. Eventually, my father signaled for the bill. The drive home was quiet. No one mentioned the sentence again. Not that night. Not the next day. In fact, the subject was never raised directly by my parents again. But the consequences did not require discussion. In the weeks that followed, small changes appeared in the structure of our relationship. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became less frequent. Conversations stayed firmly within practical territory, work updates, scheduling, occasional holiday plans. The past disappeared from our discussions entirely. My parents never admitted that anything significant had been revealed that evening. But they also never repeated the explanation that it had been a joke. They simply moved forward as if the sentence had never been spoken. The problem with that strategy is that some truths do not disappear once witnesses exist. And that night, there had been several. Life after that dinner did not collapse. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no explosive confrontations, no long emotional conversations where everything was finally explained. My parents continued living in the same house. My father continued working. My mother continued organizing her cabinets and labeling envelopes the way she always had. From the outside, the structure of our family remained intact, but something essential had shifted. Distance appeared slowly, the way quiet weather changes move through a landscape. Our phone calls became shorter. When we did speak, the conversations stayed narrow, work updates, health questions, small practical details. My father occasionally asked about taxes, almost out of habit, but he never returned to the subject of dependent filings. The past had become a sealed room. My aunt called me once, several weeks after the dinner. Her voice sounded heavier than usual. "I'm sorry you had to hear it that way," she said. I did not ask what she meant. We both understood. Other relatives reached out over time with small gestures, messages during holidays, invitations to events that had never included me before. None of them said the words directly, but the pattern was clear. Once the truth had been spoken aloud, even briefly, silence could not erase it completely. I did not ask my parents for an apology. I did not confront them with the documents I had collected. Those records remained in a folder on my computer, quietly unchanged. They no longer felt necessary, because the most important confirmation had not come from paperwork. It had come from a sentence spoken at a dinner table, and from the silence that followed it. Over time, I stopped thinking about the financial calculations that may have shaped my childhood. What mattered more was understanding something simpler. For 25 years, I believed my family had been built on quiet stability. In reality, it had been built on quiet decisions. Some of those decisions had been written into systems. Others had been carried silently by the people around the table. Now the systems were finished. The witnesses remained. And the silence, finally, belonged to me.